Hello! This short video will show you how to get started with Google COLAB. COLAB allows you to use a variety of programming languages. In this particular example, we're going to be using the R programming language. Okay, let's go ahead and get started then. So for each of the assignments, there is going to be a file folder that contains the Google COLAB document and also data files that we might be using for that assignment. So here for our first homework assignment, you can see that there's a link underneath there. This is a folder that is going to contain files for this homework assignment. So if we click on that, you can see that I have two files here. One is simply the adolescent girl heights, so that's just the data file. And then the other is the Google COLAB document. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on the Google COLAB document. Now the first thing that you're going to want to do with any Google COLAB document that you download is to obtain a copy of that file so that you have that. Okay. So if you're working on this for a while and then you need to come back to it, you're going to want to make sure and use your copy of that file. So if I go back here and click this again, okay, which is the file folder here, what that's going to do is actually get you a new version of that file, another copy of the original file. So again, what you want to do when you get a copy of a Google COLAB document is to make sure that you save that down to your drive. So I'm going to do that now. And where that gets put on your Google Drive is in the folder called COLAB Notebooks. So that is where your version of your COLAB documents sit, is in the file folder called COLAB Notebooks. So again, if you're working on something and then you need to come back to it, where you're going to find that file is in the folder called COLAB Notebooks. Now when I make changes to this document or run some of the code, okay, those changes and things that you, the code that you run, etc., will be saved into your version. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started then with our first Google COLAB document. Again, this one's written in R. Okay, so both R and Python are common in a lot of ways. And one of the ways is that they use packages. And packages are just a set of pre-existing code that you can use. So one of the packages that we're going to use right away in R is called Tidyverse. To execute this code, so this is a code block. You can see that's a little bit different than a text block here. To execute this line of code or this code chunk, what you're going to do is simply click on the Run Cell button here. And when you do that, it is going to execute lines of code. In this particular case, it's going to load this Tidyverse package. It oftentimes, when you run code, it'll give you information such as this, or if there's an error, it'll tell you that there's some type of error here. Okay, so now the next thing that I want to do is to read in the adolescent girl heights so that I can use that data. Now this code and this data is actually being run in the cloud, in the Google Cloud. So it's not being run on your local machine. It's being run in the cloud. Okay, so what I need to do is get the data file, okay, into this instance of Google COLAB so that I can do stuff with it. And this code chunk here will do that for me. So I'm going to want to click Run here. Now before I do, I want to just mention that it is important that you run these code chunks in succession. If I fail to run this code chunk, which is to read in the data file, then I'm not going to be able to print the data. So if I try to run this code chunk first, I'm going to get an error that says adolescent girl heights not found. And that is because you have not yet run this code chunk. So again, it's going to be important when you're using Google Colabs to run each code chunk in succession. And if you end up with an error like something like this, it's because this particular code chunk hasn't been run. Now you know a code chunk has been run successfully if you get a little green checkbox to the left of it. So here you can see it's kind of small, but there's a green checkbox there. This code chunk here does not have that green checkbox because I have not executed that code yet. So let's do that now. I do get my little green checkbox. So now when I ask to print the data, it's going to print just fine. One thing that you can do is, I believe it's under runtime, you can just specify to run all of the code. And that's going to go through and execute all of the code chunks in succession for the entire document, all the way down. That gets a little bit overwhelming, so at least when you're starting to out in Google Colabs, I would run each of the cells just in succession, one by one here. Okay, so let's go ahead and make predictions now for our adolescent girls. We were going to use the following formula for that. We have mother's height plus father's height minus some subtracted value, and then we're going to divide all that by 2. Now in this formula, what I want to do is specify the subtract value. So here I have that set to 8. And then what I want to do is go ahead and compute the predicted height, the error, and the absolute error when I use the subtract value of 8. And this code chunk does that for me. It also will print out the results. So the last line there is simply just says results, which is going to print the resulting data table out for me. So let's go ahead and run this code chunk. Okay, and this is one of the data tables that we had in the notes that we used for Module 1, Part 1. What we wanted to do at this point then was to compute that mean absolute prediction error. This code chunk does that. So let's go ahead and execute or run that code. And I can see that that error was 0.875. So the mean absolute prediction error, when I'm using 8 as my subtract value, is 0.875. Now the task for Module 1, Part 1, I asked you to try a subtract value of 11. So if I go back up into this code chunk and change that to an 11 instead of 8, again, I'll need to run that cell. I will need to recreate my data table using a subtract value of 11 instead of 8. So let's go ahead and run that cell again. And then again, I want to compute the mean absolute prediction error when I'm using 11 as my subtract value. And I get a mean absolute prediction error of 1.125. That should match the value that you got when you did it with a spreadsheet. I think 9 was my best subtract value. So if we put 9 in there, execute that code. So now the subtract value is actually 9. And that subtract value here is getting used in this next code chunk. So you can see that it'll put 9 right here in that formula for me. So we'll go ahead and run that and get the MAPE for the value of 9, and I get 0.625. Okay, there may be situations where I want you to run some of this code or execute code, and then save out the file or the resulting file that you would get from the code. And this code chunk does that. Before I run this code chunk, let's go ahead and show you where the information or that data table is going to be put. So it's here in the Files folder and then under Sample Data. Now there is existing data, okay, in the Sample Data folder. And you can either delete all of that out if you want, or it doesn't matter. You can just leave them in there. It's not going to hurt anything. But I want to save the results data table into this folder. So that's what this code chunk is going to do. Let's go ahead and execute that. Refresh the folder. Oh, let's see here. There we go. Refresh the folder, and results.csv is here. If you need a copy of that, what you can do is right-click and say download, and this will save it down to your local computer, and then you can open that up, for example, in a spreadsheet. So that is going to be under your files here. Again, it's that icon right there, and then sample data is where that's located. Okay, lastly, down here in the bottom, I went ahead and just created that plot that I had in the notes. So this code down here will create that plot for me. And you can see that the value of 9 here, that's kind of small, but the value of 9 minimizes my mean absolute prediction error. Okay, that's my introduction to Google Colabs. Again, the most important step here is to make sure that you save a copy of that before you start executing code or changing your code. And that copy of that file is going to be in the folder Colab Notebooks. All right, that does it then for the introduction to Google Colabs. Thank you. Have a good day.